Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So if people would like to come in and take a seat. I'm Janet Lambert. I'm the CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th annual ARM Investor Day. This year's meeting is our biggest ever, and bigger is a theme you'll hear a lot about as I go through a sector overview in a couple of minutes. Let me thank those of you who braved the winds of Boston and the snow of Minnesota. It's been an oddly intense weather couple of days, I think, in many parts of the country, and I know it was not easy for some of you to get here, but we're really happy to have you. Our purpose in this meeting is to provide a slightly different opportunity than many of you get at traditional bank events that focus on this space by giving you a broader portfolio of companies to look at, along with some commentary from experts in the field. Sorry, let me get going. For those of you who are new to the meeting and maybe to the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, we are the only international advocacy organization focused exclusively on the regenerative medicine space, that is, gene therapy, cell therapy, and tissue engineering. We have nearly 300 member organizations spanning the continuum of therapeutic developers to patient advocacy organizations to nonprofits and research institutions. The Alliance has 5 core priorities, which are listed here. They are to advocate for clear and predictable and harmonized regulatory and review pathways. And for those of you familiar with the RMAT designation at the FDA, that was the product of ARM's advocacy work. We're focused on enabling market access and value-based favorable reimbursement policies, which are obviously a prime issue now that we have products in the market. We're focused intensely on the industrialization and manufacturing hurdles of this space and addressing those things that are best addressed through joint activity of the full community. We do quite a bit of stakeholder outreach, communications, and education, and in fact, the data that I'll show you in a minute is a unique data set that ARM pulls together with our data partner Informa to track and characterize the sector. Finally, we conduct events like this one to facilitate access to capital and also work to identify sources of public funding for those member organizations. So, first, let me set the stage for the presentations that you'll hear later today by giving something of a sector overview. In 2017, we saw substantial global financings in the cell and gene sector. $7.5 billion raised worldwide, excluding M&A. 2018 continues that trend and, in fact, sees an acceleration of that trend, with Q1 financing totals of $3.4 billion, nearly twice what we saw in the first quarter of last year. We've seen significant recent product approvals and obviously many more in the pipeline, both in the US and around the world. The clinical pipeline is robust, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We see greater and greater public interest in this sector and its promise, and we also see strong investor and analyst interest in this space, as indicated by those of you being here today. So this is sort of the view of the sector as we track it. We're currently tracking 861 companies around the world. As you can see, the community is heavily concentrated in the United States, but there are also significant groups of companies in both Europe and increasingly in Asia. In terms of the clinical pipeline, we continue to see the pipeline grow through all phases. We now track 320 phase 1 therapies, 549 phase 2, and 90 phase 3, and you can see here on the slide the growth that represents from last year. To give you a little bit more of a breakdown about this pipeline, I'll describe the phases by technologies. So in phase 1 of that total 320 number, we have 110 in gene therapy, 121 in gene-modified cell therapy, 84 in cell therapy, and 5 in tissue engineering. In phase 2, we have 174 in gene therapy, 152 in gene-modified cell therapy, 211 in cell therapy, and 12 in tissue engineering. And lastly, phase 3, 35 in gene therapy, 11 in gene-modified cell therapy, 37 in cell therapy, and 7 in tissue engineering. The total global financings picture of the first quarter is very, very encouraging. The financing totals of this quarter were, as I mentioned earlier, double what we saw in Q1 2017 and higher than any Q1 since we've been tracking this data. And again, that does not include the M&A activity that we've seen in this space. Some of the significant high-value Q1 deals by technology type, working clockwise around the technologies on this slide. In gene therapy and genome editing, we saw Sangamo with one of several collaborations they've announced of late in a $3.2 billion collaboration deal with Kite. AbbVie signed a $1.1 billion agreement with Voyager Therapeutics, including $60 million in upfront payments. In cell-based immunotherapy, we also saw several large financings, including TCR Squared's $125 million Series B in March, and Community Therapeutics' $100 million Series A in January. In cell therapy, Iovance Biotherapeutics raised $172 million in a public offering in January, and in tissue engineering, Cellularity secured an impressive $250 million in venture financing in February. Here is a breakdown of these financings by type, and you'll notice that in several of these financing categories, Q1 has surpassed or come close to surpassing the full year amounts for 2017. This is definitely the case in follow-on financings, where among the largest follow-on financings were Bluebird Bio's $651 million raise in January, Avexis, $431 million, also January, Audentes Therapeutics, $231 million in January, and Rocket Pharma, $83 million in January. Some of the largest venture financings of Q1, I mentioned a moment ago, including Cellularity, TCR Squared, and Community. But in addition, we saw Generation Bio raise $100 million, and Prevail and Humacyte each raised $75 million, bringing the Q1 VC total within just a whisker of the 2016 total and not far off the 2017 total. Corporate partnerships with upfront payments were also robust in Q1, including the Sangamo Kite deal, which included $150 million upfront, Spark and Novartis for $170 million total and $105 million upfront, Regenerative Bio and Avexis for $260 million and $80 million upfront, and the Voyager AbbVie deal for $1.1 billion total included $69 million upfront. We also saw some large private placements. Rubius Therapeutics raised $100 million in March, and CarsGen Therapeutics, $60 million, also in March. So needless to say, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for this space, and the financing community and the science continues to warrant this kind of investment. Lastly, of course, we need to talk about the M&A experience, which has been exciting of late, and particularly in the first quarter. We saw Celgene's $9 billion acquisition of Juno Therapeutics in March, Astellas acquisition of Universal Cells in February, Cellularity acquired Aliqua Biomedical in January, and several others. This is on top of a very active 2017 that included the acquisitions of Kite, Dendrion, Calamune, Cell Design Labs, and Dimension Therapeutics. And of course, there are currently many reports of M&A deals currently under consideration or in pursuit. This is a summary of some of what I've just said, and including a few other companies that have made notable corporate partnerships and collaborations, significant follow-on financings, or substantial venture financings. Lastly, just to say a word about public company stock performance. Looking at the stock performance over the last year, we see that gene therapy and cell-based IO outperformed both the NASDAQ and the NASDAQ Biotech Index significantly. The data show that more than 50% of the top-performing biotech IPOs since 2015 are regenerative medicine and advanced therapies companies, 11 out of the top 20. And in fact, 5 out of the top 6 top-performing IPOs are in the regenerative medicine sector. The RMAT average that we're tracking here includes 73 companies. The IO average includes 14 companies. And the gene therapy average that we're tracking here includes 29 companies devoted exclusively or primarily to those technology spaces. So it's with this broader context that we get to talk to you today about a number of specific companies as well as about some of the key trends in our space.